Hi, Mary Lynn here again. Have you ever had problems getting your photos in focus? Do you take a photo and look at it on the back of your camera and find that it's either blurry or just plain soft and you're not sure what to do about it? Well, this video addresses that. We are going to talk about common reasons why your images might be out of focus and what you can do to resolve that. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so now let's shift over to talk about focusing. And I will tell you, and I see it always in the chat, and I see it in the comments people send me when they register for my classes. Out of focus images are the number one problem people experience with their photos, and the number one problem that I see when I'm taking a look at and reviewing other people's photos. There are actually a multitude of things that affect whether or not a photograph is going to be in focus or not. And they include your shutter speed, camera shake, is your camera moving or not, and the focus method that you have selected. So let's just talk about each of these. Now, your shutter speed affects whether or not your photo is going to be sharp in a couple different ways, actually. So if your shutter speed is too slow, you actually risk having a blurry image for one of two different reasons. One is you may get a blurry photo resulting from camera shake, and you also may get a blurry photo resulting from your subject's movement. And so I want to talk about each of these. And first of all, let's talk about how to prevent getting blurry photos from camera shake. First, and the one that's probably most obvious, is you want to use a tripod if and when it makes sense. And you know what? I know that using a tripod is many, many times not that practical. I photograph babies and kids and dogs and stuff, and you can't run around a field carrying your camera, chasing a kid, and trying to keep resetting your tripod up and down. And there's so many situations where by the time you get your tripod set up and set at the right height and everything, the moment is gone, right? So I get it. But when you can use a tripod, man, do I recommend it. If you're doing the landscape, absolutely no reason not to use a tripod, except for the reason if maybe you don't have one with you. Close-up macro photography, again, a tripod is really handy to have, and even a monopod too. A monopod is a great option if you're doing sports photography. I just have a cheap little monopod that hardly costs me anything that I throw in the back of the car and take if I'm going to watch a sporting event or something, just to have something to help steady the camera, because that will help keep your camera from shaking, right? So that's the first tip. The second one is you want to make sure that the vibration reduction or image stabilization switch on your lens is turned on when you're hand holding. Now, some of you guys are looking at your lenses and you're like, well, I don't even have a switch like that. So you may be looking for something that says VR or IS. It might say stabilizer, or you may not have the switch. So that Nifty 50 lens I talked about earlier, that doesn't have it. And the older lenses, most of my lenses, I would say, probably don't have it because they're a little bit older, but the newer lenses are going to have it. And it does make a huge difference when you're using it to be able to help let you photograph at slower shutter speeds without worrying about having blurry photos from camera shake. I got my first lens with vibration reduction only a few years ago, and my gosh, does it make a difference. Now, some of you guys are seeing a different switch. You're seeing one that says A/M or AF/MF, and that's not the switch I'm talking about. Okay, so another little tip is you want to have that on when hand holding, but actually when you have your camera on a tripod, you want to have that switch off. The reason for this is that what I have read is if you leave it on while you're on a tripod, then your camera is actually sort of trying to compensate for shake that doesn't exist. And then it's actually going to create blur when it shouldn't, interestingly. Another thing that you need to take into consideration to prevent getting blurry photos from camera shake is that you need to have a fast enough shutter speed. Now, how fast? First of all, part of that is going to depend on if you have a vibration reduction / image stabilization lens or not. If you do, you can probably get away with hand holding at slower shutter speeds than you couldn't otherwise. But a lot of times I teach these group classes and I'll have someone in my class that says, oh, I can hand hold at 1/8 of a second, no problem. But you know what? Maybe they can. Maybe they held their breath and held it really still. But what if you were outside in a crowd or whatever, someone bumps you or, whatever happens like that, you happen to sneeze, I don't know. 1/8 of a second is probably too slow for most situations to be able to hand hold. So, you might have to play around with it though. and in the length of your lens is even going to impact how slow of a shutter speed you can handhold at. But anyway, I would try to get it up to at least a 30th of a second, maybe a 60th of a second. And here's the thing, there's some times when you can't do that. If you're in a low light situation, your shutter speed, it just doesn't want to go up any higher than, say, a quarter of a second or an eighth of a second. So in that case, what the heck are you going to do? Now, that's when your ISO kicks in. So let's talk about that. For those of you who don't know what ISO is, that is your camera sensor sensitivity to light. And so increasing the ISO enables you to get a faster shutter speed when you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So the general rule of thumb here is that you want to use a lower ISO number when you're in a bright light situation. So like when you're outside in the bright sun, or in a higher ISO number when you're in a low light situation. So you're inside, for instance, you're usually going to need to use a higher ISO number. The thing to keep in mind is that you want to keep your ISO in general as low as possible, because the lower ISOs have a better quality at 1600 all the time, but you don't, because the quality of your ultimate photo is not going to be as high at the higher ISO. But I always think it's better to have slightly grainy, we'll call it grainy, they call it digital noise, but I'd rather have a slightly grainy image than I would to have a photo that's out of focus because they're of camera shake. So anyway, it's always a trade-off. All these different things is always a trade-off in photography. But those are the general rules. So how do you change your ISO? A lot of you guys are probably looking at your camera and you see the button right there, because on most cameras, there is a button right there on the body that you press, and then you can rotate a dial and change it. But some of the cameras don't have that, specifically the entry-level Nikon. So I'm talking D3000 series, D5000 series, maybe some of the earlier ones too. You aren't even seeing an ISO button. So for you guys, what you're going to do is you look at the back of your camera, there's that little fat lowercase I button. That's what I call it anyway, the info button or whatever they call it. You press that button and then you press it a second time and you'll see the menu on the back. You'll get a little yellow rectangle that then you can use your arrow keys to move around and move it to where you can change your ISO. That's how you do it on those cameras. But like I said, all the others, you just can press the button on the body. So let's talk about preventing blurry photos resulting from subject movement. We were just talking about preventing it from camera shake. Now let's talk about subject movement. So you just need a shutter speed that's fast enough to be able to freeze the motion, and how quickly your subject is moving is going to determine how fast that needs to be. Someone who's just standing there and swaying ever so slightly while they're breathing, you don't need as quick of a shutter speed as you do if you're photographing a hockey player on the ice. You might need 1,000th of a shutter speed, 1,000th of a second for the hockey player, whereas you maybe only need a 1/60th, 1/90th, 1/125th of a second for the person who's just standing there. And again, you're going to experience the problem again. If you're in a low light situation, you can't get your shutter speed fast enough. Remember, that's where you're going to bump up, increase your ISO so that you can get a faster shutter speed. Now, your camera probably also has an auto ISO feature, which for a lot of people is not a bad idea. You set your ISO to auto ISO, and then the camera just bumps it up when it realizes the shutter speed isn't going to be fast enough. That's one way of getting around having to worry too much about your ISO. But if you're going to be photographing in manual mode, which I know some of you are, in that case, I would probably take it off of auto ISO so that you control all three elements, the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So we talked about getting sharper photos by preventing blur from camera shake and preventing blur from having too slow of a shutter speed when your subject is moving. But let's also talk about your camera's focusing modes. And these range from totally manual at the one extreme to totally automatic focusing at the other extreme. So at the one end of the spectrum, your camera totally figures out what to focus on by itself. This is the default mode that your camera came set with. You may still be in this mode. You may have since changed it. I know we have a bunch of people with a bunch of different cameras and different levels of experience in here. So some of you may have gotten out of there already, but many of you still, this is the mode you're using. So in other words, you point your camera at something, press the shutter button, and your camera basically figures out what it thinks the subject is, and then it focuses on that, which is great much of the time. However, as you guys know, sometimes what the camera wants to focus on and what you want to focus on are not the same thing. And it's so frustrating. So at the other end of the spectrum is manual focusing, where you rotate the focusing ring on your lens to totally control the focus. But before you do that, I want to talk about a couple things. I don't want you to try doing it quite yet. So first of all, I wanted to just, as an aside, mention that manual focus and manual exposure are two different things. So manual focus is what we're talking about right now. Manual exposure is where you control the exposure. It's one of the creative exposure modes where you control the f-stop and the shutter speed. It's not the same thing. A lot of times people get those confused and think when someone's talking about one that they're talking about the other. So if someone says, oh, I always shoot in manual mode, they're probably saying they always use manual exposure mode. Just wanted to point that out so you guys had that clear. So anyway, to focus manually, here's what you have to do. On most of the cameras, there's only one thing you have to do, but on some of the cameras, there's two things you have to do before you can do it. What you're going to do, you're going to look at your lens there, and there's a switch on your lens that says AF/MF or A/M. And what you're going to do is you're going to take that switch and you're going to move it over to M or MF. Now, if you have one of the higher end, more expensive Nikons, there's also going to be a little switch on the body of your camera. It's going to be down on the front of your camera by the lens. And there's a little switch there. And you're going to switch that over to M as well. Again, that's like the Nikon D7000 series, D600, D700, 800 and higher. Those ones, you're probably going to have to do that. But on the others, you only have to do the one. So you get that switched. Then you're going to rotate. If you have a zoom lens, you have two rings, ridged rings on your lens. You're going to rotate the more narrow of the two. You look through your viewfinder, rotate that more narrow one, and that's how you're going to do manual focusing. If you have a fixed length lens, a prime lens, that's only one length, you only have one ring to rotate, and that's the one. That's your focusing ring. Now, some of you are probably looking at your lens and saying, all I see is the wider one that you use to zoom. I don't see the skinny one you're talking about. So for you guys, do this. Look at where the glass is of your lens. So look at the end of your lens and just right around the very front, whatever, where the glass is. There's a little skinny ridged ring right there, and that's what you're going to rotate. So if you're holding your camera in your hand right now, you can give it a try. You don't need to try it right now though, but you'll see that your subject will come in and out of focus as you rotate that ring. I want to make sure though, when you're done doing that while you're sitting here with me in this class, be sure you switch it all back to auto focus so that you don't leave here and then all of a sudden all your photos are out of focus. I don't want that. Anyway, that's how you do manual focus, but here's the thing. You're probably not going to be using manual focus all that often. You may use it. There are some situations where it is absolutely the best way to go. People tell me all the time that they have a hard time getting their camera to focus if they're trying to take a picture of the nighttime sky. Because autofocus, any of the modes of autofocus, including the ones we're going to talk about next, they require contrast. And if you can't get contrast, you can't get in focus. So switching it to manual focus bypasses that problem. So manual focus is great for nighttime sky. It's great for close-ups. And there are other situations where it absolutely makes sense. But more than anything, I want you guys to know that it's there and it's available. But many of the times you don't want the camera to totally focus, right? To totally decide the focus. And you don't want to do manual focusing, because imagine chasing a dog or kid around the yard and trying to rotate your focus ring really quick as you do that. Just not practical, right? So what you want to use an autofocus mode that lets you select the point that's going to be in focus, but then the camera does the actual focusing for you. And there's a couple different modes, autofocus modes, that work slightly differently, but that both let you do this. One of these modes is great for stationary subjects, and the other one is great for moving subjects. Now, the first of the autofocus modes, where you have this control of selecting the point and letting the camera do the actual focusing, is AF-S. That's what it would be on Nikon or Sony and probably some of the other DSLRs. And then on Canon, it's called one shot. And in this mode, you select a focus point, you focus on your subject, you press the shutter button, and the subject comes into focus. In this mode, you can also hold down your shutter button halfway and then move the camera slightly from side to side to sort of recompose the image through the viewfinder. The second of the autofocus modes where you have control like this is called AF-C on Nikon or Sony, and then on Canon, it's called AI Servo. This one's best for moving subjects. So you remember that picture where I had a picture of my son? He was running and I caught him completely sharp while he was running on the lacrosse field. I used this mode. I kept the focus point on him while he was running. I held down the shutter button and kept it on him. And so the camera just keeps refocusing on your moving subject. Very cool, but it does take a little bit of practice to get used to it and to get it to work quite right. Now, some of you also are probably looking at you're looking at your focusing modes, and you're either saying, hey, but what's this AF-A or what's this AI focus mode that I see? Those are the ones, they're sort of a hybrid in between the two modes, and they're more auto where the camera is making more decisions. And so I would avoid using those modes and opt for one of these instead. Now, I use AFS most of the time. Sometimes, if I do have that running dog or child, I'll switch over to AFC. But much of the time, the subject I'm photographing is stationary, and so I use AFS. Now, here I know that some of you guys are like, hey, how do I change it on my camera? And the thing is, there are so many different cameras and so many different ways to change it. It's not the same on all Nikons. It's not the same on all Canons. And it's one of those things that if we were in my in-person workshop, or if we were doing my longer online workshop, I would go through and I would say, okay, this is how you do it on this camera. This is how you do it on this camera. My in-person one, I'd be walking around showing you guys all how to do it. More than anything, I just want you guys to know that those modes exist, that there is a way that you can pinpoint focus, that you can get that picture like the one I had with my doggie where she was in focus, but the tree in between us was out of focus. Know that there's a way that you can get something that's moving in focus without just using autofocus, because if you just use autofocus, pure autofocus for those, that you're not going to get the results you want. More than anything, I just want you to know that those exist. You may have to check out your manual to see how to do it. I'll give you a quick tip on many of the Canons. You'll use that AF button on the back or the AF button on the top. With the Nikons, it gets a little more challenging to explain how to change it. But anyway, I just want you guys to know that those exist. When you use either of these focusing modes, you'll be able to select a specific point within the frame. So when you press your shutter button, whatever that point in the viewfinder is touching is what will come into focus. You can refer to your manual to see how to move focus points around with your specific camera. Let's take a quick look at where we've been so far and where we're going. We talked about the many reasons why keeping your camera in auto mode limits your ability to achieve your creative vision. To start to remedy that, we introduced your camera's creative exposure modes, which give you so much more control. You now know how to use aperture priority mode to change your f-stop to alter your depth of field. You've learned that doing that enables you to get those nice blurry backgrounds, or alternatively, to keep everything in sharp focus when you're photographing landscapes and that sort of thing. You also now know how to use shutter priority mode to increase your shutter speed to keep moving subjects in focus, and also to slow down your shutter speed to achieve some cool effects like smooth flowing rivers and waterfalls, among other things as well. You've also learned that it's possible to pinpoint the exact part of the image you want in focus, regardless of whether your subject is moving or staying put in one spot. Those tips should get you up and running, but there are still plenty of things you need to know about your camera before you can really master it. For instance, what lens should you use for what? How do you prevent funky color casts in your images? How do you get your photos exposed correctly in manual mode? Should you be shooting in RAW file format? The list goes on and on and on, and I will cover all of those questions plus so many more in my DSLR Savvy video series that you will also find here on YouTube. If you found value in this video today, go ahead and click like below and subscribe so you can get all of my upcoming content. Thanks so much for watching.